In the month of June, 323 years before the Common Era, the most powerful man in the known world lay dying in a palace that was not his own. Alexander, king of Makedonia, Pharaoh of Egypt, great king of Persia, lay fevered and delirious in Babylon, his body racked by an illness that would claim him in 13 days. He was 32 years old. Around him, his generals whispered and schemed, already carving his vast empire into pieces with their eyes. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, Alexander allegedly whispered a single devastating word to the strongest. Whether truth or legend, those words would condemn hundreds of thousands to death in the wars that followed, a fitting epitaph for a man whose brilliance had already drowned the ancient world in blood. But how does a mortal become a god of war? How does a boy from a small kingdom in northern Greece bring 3 great empires to their knees? The answer lies not in the fevered dreams of his final days, but in the fires of his beginning. In the year 356, before the Common Era, in the ancient Macedonian capital of Pella, a son was born to King Philippos II and his wife Olympias of Epirus. The omens surrounding his birth were, according to later accounts, extraordinary. The great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned that same night, one of the 7 wonders of the world, consumed by flames. Persian magi reportedly interpreted this as a sign of catastrophe for Asia. Olympias, a devotee of the mystery cults who claimed descent from Achilles himself, whispered to her son that his true father was Zeus, king of the gods, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. Whether Alexander believed this divine parentage remains debated among historians. What is certain, according to the ancient biographer Plutarchus, whose life of Alexander remains our most detailed source, is that the young prince displayed extraordinary qualities from childhood. When Thessalian horse traders presented an unbreakable stallion named Bucephalus, the young Alexander noticed what others had missed. The horse feared its own shadow. Turning the animal toward the sun, he mounted and rode the beast that would carry him across 3 continents. Philippos, watching, reportedly wept and declared, "My son, seek out a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." At 13, Alexander's education was entrusted to perhaps the greatest mind of the ancient world, Aristotle of Stagira. For 3 years in the gardens of Mysa, the philosopher molded the prince's intellect. They studied Homer's Iliad. Alexander would sleep with a copy beneath his pillow for the rest of his life, alongside a dagger. He learned medicine, philosophy, and the natural sciences. More importantly, he absorbed the Greek conviction that Hellenes were inherently superior to Barbaroi, all non-Greeks, a belief that would justify conquest as civilization. Yet Philippus's shadow loomed large. The king was transforming Macedonia from a backwater into a military superpower. His revolutionary phalanx, armed with 6-meter Saracen spears, crushed the proud city-states of Greece. By 338, at the Battle of Chaeronea, 18-year-old Alexander commanded the elite companion cavalry that shattered the sacred band of Thebes. Father and son had conquered Greece together. Then came rupture. Philippos took a new wife, a full-blooded Macedonian noblewoman. At the wedding feast, a general toasted for a legitimate heir. Alexander hurled his cup at the man's head. Philippos drew his sword against his own son, only to stumble drunkenly. "Here's the man who would cross from Europe to Asia," Alexander sneered, "and he cannot cross from one couch to another." In 336, Philippos was assassinated by a bodyguard at his daughter's wedding. Alexander, at 20 years old, was king. The circumstances remain suspicious to this day. Olympias had motive. Alexander had motive. The truth died with the assassin, killed immediately by Alexander's companions. What followed would reshape the world forever. Alexander's first acts as king were swift and merciless. Potential rivals to his throne cousins, half-brothers, anyone with a claim to power, were systematically eliminated. His mother, Olympias, proved equally ruthless, allegedly forcing Philippus's young widow Cleopatra to watch her infant daughter killed before compelling her to hang herself. The new king had learned a fundamental lesson. Mercy toward enemies was merely delayed suicide. But the Greek city-state saw opportunity in Philippus's death. Thebes rebelled, encouraged by rumors that Alexander himself had died fighting northern tribes. The rumor was premature. Alexander's force marched his army over 300 kilometers in 13 days, and appeared before Thebes's walls like a vengeful apparition. What followed was a calculated atrocity. In the autumn of 335, Thebes was stormed, its population massacred or enslaved, its buildings razed to the foundations. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindaros were spared. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. 6,000 were killed in the fighting. Alexander had sent a message written in blood and ash to every Greek polis. Rebellion meant annihilation. Athens surrendered without resistance. The League of Corinth acclaimed Alexander as hegemon and Strategos autocrator supreme, commander for the war against Persia that his father had planned. In the spring of 334, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. He would never see Macedonia again. Upon landing in Asia Minor, Alexander made a pilgrimage to the ruins of Troy. He anointed himself with oil at the supposed tomb of Achilles, exchanging his armor for relics said to belong to the hero. His companion, Hypastian, honored Patroclus' tomb near Baia, parallel that would resonate tragically years later. This was not mere theatrics. Alexander was announcing himself as the new Achilles, come to finish what the Greeks had begun 1,000 years before. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor gathered their forces at the Granicos River. They possessed numerical superiority in the high ground of the riverbank. Persian tactical doctrine suggested waiting for Alexander to attempt a difficult crossing, then crushing him midstream. But the Greek mercenary commander Memnon of Rhodes urged a different strategy: scorched earth, denying Alexander supplies, drawing him deep into Asia where his lines would stretch thin. The satraps refused. They were proud nobles who considered retreat dishonorable. It was a fatal miscalculation. Alexander led the companion cavalry directly into the river, arrows and javelins darkening the sky above him. He emerged on the Persian bank in the midst of their cavalry, his helmet plume marking him as a target. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates raised his scimitar to cleave Alexander's skull and was cut down by Cleitos the Black, who severed the man's arm in mid-swing. It was the first of several occasions when Alexander's reckless personal bravery nearly ended his campaign before it began. The Persian line collapsed. The Greek mercenaries who formed the Persian infantry were surrounded and slaughtered. Alexander ordered no quarter, declaring them traitors to Hellas. Only 2,000 survived as prisoners, sent to hard labor in Makedonia. As Alexander swept through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities from Persian rule, he encountered legend at Gordion. There, in the temple of Zeus, an ancient wagon was bound to a pole by an impossibly complex knot. Prophecy declared that whoever loosed the Gordian knot would rule all Asia. Alexander examined the knot, found no ends to work with, and drew his sword. With a single stroke, he cut the knot apart. Thunder reportedly rolled across a cloudless sky. Whether this actually occurred, or was invented afterward, matters less than the psychological truth it conveyed. Alexander would not play by established rules. He would cut through obstacles rather than unravel them. In November of 333, Alexander faced Darius III himself at Issos. The great king had brought the full might of the Achaemenid Empire, perhaps 100,000 soldiers, and had maneuvered behind Alexander, cutting his supply lines. The Macedonians were trapped between the Persian army and hostile territory. Alexander did what he would always do. He attacked. The battle was joined on a narrow coastal plain where Persian numbers were negated. Alexander spotted Darius's position and led a direct cavalry charge at the great king himself. The Persian line buckled. Darius, watching Alexander's blood-spattered cavalry approach, lost his nerve and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king retreat, dissolved into chaos. That night, Alexander dined in Darius's tent, using the great king's golden vessels. He had captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. He treated them with elaborate courtesy, but Persia itself now lay open before him. Not all fell willingly before Alexander's advance. The ancient Phoenician city of Tyros, perched on an island half a kilometer offshore, refused to surrender in the winter of 332. The Tyrians believed themselves impregnable. Their walls rose directly from the sea. They commanded the strongest navy in the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander's response was characteristic. He would build a causeway, a mole from the mainland to the island. For 7 months, his engineers labored under constant harassment. Tyrian ships bombarded the workers with burning sand and superheated bronze. Fire ships destroyed siege towers. The Macedonians drowned by the hundreds. When the causeway finally reached the walls, the assault was apocalyptic. Siege engines breached the fortifications. Macedonian soldiers poured through. What followed was not battle, but butchery. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting and its immediate aftermath. 2,000 military-aged men were crucified along the beach forest of crosses, stretching 4 kilometers along the coast. 30,000 civilians were sold into slavery. Alexander had made another example. He had also revealed something darker within himself, rage that emerged when his will was thwarted, a cruelty that would grow as the campaign progressed. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, assuming the divine titles of the ancient kings. Then he ventured into the Libyan desert to consult the oracle of Zeusimon at the oasis of Siwa. What the oracle told him remained secret. He reportedly claimed he would only reveal it to his mother, and then only in person. But ancient sources agree on one detail. The priest greeted Alexander as son of Ammon. Alexander seemed to accept this divine parentage. From this point forward, he began wearing the ram's horns of Ammon on his coins and correspondence. The Macedonian king was becoming something else, something more than mortal in his own conception. He founded Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, the first of dozens of cities that would bear his name across Asia. It would become one of the great metropolises of the ancient world, housing the famous library and lighthouse. But Alexander never stayed to see what he had planted. On the 1st of October, 331, on a plain near the village of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, Alexander faced Darius's final army. The great king had assembled forces from across his empire, perhaps 200,000 men, including war elephants, scythe chariots, and the elite immortals. He had chosen and flattened the battlefield to favor his chariots and cavalry, who would not make the mistakes of Issos. Alexander's army numbered perhaps 47,000. They were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. The battle opened with Persian chariot charges that achieved little. The Macedonians simply parted ranks to let them pass, cutting down horses and drivers as they went. Then Alexander executed a brilliant tactical maneuver, drawing Persian cavalry to the flanks and opening a gap in their line. He saw it, gathered his companions, and drove like a spear point directly toward delirious. Once again, the great king broke. He fled the battlefield while his army still fought, racing east toward the heartland of his empire. The Persian army disintegrated. Casualty figures are unreliable, but ancient sources suggest 40 to 90,000 Persian dead. Macedonian losses were fewer than 500. The Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled from Egypt to India for 2 centuries, effectively ceased to exist that afternoon. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, then Susa with its legendary treasury. Finally, in January of 330, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. What happened next remains controversial. After months of occupation, Persepolis burned. The magnificent palace complex, with its towering columns and intricate reliefs, many of which still showed their painted colors, was consumed by flame. Ancient sources offer 2 accounts. The first, Alexander deliberately burned Persepolis as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athenian temples during Xerxes' invasion 150 years before. The second, the burning was accidental, sparked during a drunken revel when the Athenian courtesan Tai suggested the idea. Whatever the cause, the result was the destruction of one of the ancient world's greatest architectural achievements. Alexander reportedly expressed regret almost immediately. But the fire also served as transformation. The war of revenge against Persia was symbolically complete. What followed would be something different, pure conquest for its own sake. Alexander was no longer the hegemon of Greece avenging old wrongs. He was becoming the successor to Darius, was becoming the great king himself. Power changes men, and unlimited power had begun its corrosive work on Alexander. In the autumn of 330, a plot was allegedly discovered against the king's life. Philotas, son of Parmenion, one of Alexander's senior commanders, was accused of knowing about the conspiracy and failing to report it. The evidence was questionable. Philotas had enemies at court who had whispered against him. Under torture, he confessed to whatever was demanded. He was executed by javelin before the assembled army. But Philotas's father, Parmenion, remained alive, the most senior general in the army, commanding the treasury at Ecbatana, with significant forces at his disposal. Alexander sent riders ahead of the news of Philotas's death. They carried orders. Parmenion was murdered by his own officers, stabbed repeatedly before he could learn of his son's fate. He had served the Macedonian throne loyally for over 40 years, first under Philippos, then under Alexander. His reward was assassination, ordered by a king who could no longer tolerate even the potential for threat. The army murmured, but no one resisted. They were too far from home, too dependent on Alexander, too afraid of what he had become. The following year brought an even more disturbing incident. At Makedonia, deep in Central Asia, Alexander held a feast. He had been drinking heavily. A family traitan had surrounded himself with flatterers, who praised him above his father Philippos. Cleitos the Black, the veteran officer who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicos River, could bear it no longer. He began defending Philippus's memory, mocking Alexander's pretensions to divinity, reminding him that his victories belonged to the Macedonian army, not to any god. Alexander warned him to stop. Cleitos continued. What happened next was witnessed by dozens. Alexander seized a spear from a guard and hurled it through Cleitos's chest. The man who had saved his life died at his feet. The king's reaction was immediate and extreme. He barricaded himself in his chambers, refusing food or water for 3 days, weeping and calling out Cleitos's name. His companions feared he would kill himself. Court philosophers were summoned to absolve him of guilt, arguing that kings were above ordinary morality, that Cleitos had provoked his own death. Eventually, Alexander emerged. The campaigns continued, but something had broken. The Macedonian army had witnessed their king murder one of his oldest companions in a drunken rage and then be talked out of his grief by sycophants. The golden boy of Chaeronea was gone forever. In 300, Alexander instituted proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostration before the great king at his court. Greeks and Macedonians were expected to bow before Alexander as Persians did before their rulers. The gesture implied divine status. The backlash was fierce. To Greeks, proskynesis was reserved for gods alone. To prostrate oneself before another human was the act of a slave. The court historian Callisthenes publicly refused. Others followed his lead. Alexander withdrew the requirement for Greeks and Macedonians, accepting a compromise. But Callisthenes was later implicated in another alleged conspiracy among the royal pages and executed, tortured to death in a cage. According to some sources, or crucified according to others, the man who had documented Alexander's achievements, who had crafted much of the propaganda that built his legend, died at his command. In 326, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush and invaded India. At the Hydaspes River, he faced King Poros and his war elephants. It was his last great battle, a bloody, close-run engagement, won by tactical brilliance and sheer stubbornness. Poros, captured, was asked how he wished to be treated. As a king, he replied. Alexander, impressed, restored his kingdom and made him an ally. But the army had reached its limit. At the Hyphasis River, facing the monsoon rains and rumors of vast kingdoms beyond, with thousands more elephants, the Macedonian army refused to advance. They had marched over 25,000 kilometers. They had fought in every terrain imaginable. They wanted to go home. Alexander raged, pleaded, sulked in his tent for 3 days. The army did not relent. For the first and only time, he turned back. His revenge was terrible, though perhaps not consciously so. Rather than return by the route they had come, Alexander led a portion of his army through the Jedrosian desert, modern Baluchistan. It was one of the most inhospitable places on earth. The march became a death march. Heat stroke, dehydration, starvation, and flash floods killed more Macedonians than all the battles of the campaign combined. Some ancient sources estimate 60,000 casualties, though modern historians suggest the figure may be lower. Soldiers watched their companions die of thirst within sight of the sea. Women and children following the army perished in uncounted thousands. Why did Alexander choose this route? Ancient sources suggest he wanted to outdo the legendary queens Semiramis and Kairos the Great, both of whom had supposedly lost armies in this desert. If so, it was the ultimate expression of his hubris, sacrificing his own men to surpass mythological figures. When the survivors finally reached Susa in early 324, they found an empire in administrative chaos. Alexander's response was another purge, executing satraps and officials across the empire for corruption and incompetence. The conquests were over. The dying had just begun. In October of 324, at Ecbatana, Hephaestion died. He was Alexander's closest companion, the Patroclus to his Achilles and, possibly his lover. The grief that followed exceeded all bounds. Alexander refused to eat for days. He ordered the manes of all horses and mules in the army cut short in mourning. He crucified the physician who had failed to save Hephaestion. He reportedly requested divine honors for the dead man from the oracle at Sayu settling, for heroic honors when full divinity was denied. He planned a funeral pyre that would cost 12,000 talents, employing architects to construct a monument of extraordinary extravagance. Some ancient sources suggest Alexander's own death wish began here. He threw himself into unnecessary dangers, campaigned through winter against mountain tribes with reckless abandon. He was wounded repeatedly. When he finally returned to Babylon in the spring of 323, he was already broken in some fundamental way. On the 28th day of May, 323 before the Common Era, Alexander attended a feast at the house of his companion Medeos. He drank heavily. The following day, he developed a fever. Over the next 13 days, his condition deteriorated steadily. He continued to plan a naval expedition to Arabia. He continued to issue orders, continued to believe he would recover. On the 10th or 11th of June, Alexander of Makedonia died. He was 32 years old. What killed him? Theories abound. Typhoid fever complicated by alcoholism is a common modern diagnosis. Malaria has been suggested. Some ancient sources hinted at poison, administered by Antipater, whom Alexander had ordered replaced as regent of Macedonia. Others point to accumulated wounds, infections, and the simple exhaustion of a body driven beyond human limits for over a decade. The truth is unknowable. What is certain is that Alexander left no capable heir, no succession plan, no instructions beyond those ambiguous words, to the strongest. Within hours of Alexander's death, his generals were at each other's throats. His half-brother Philippos III, who suffered from mental disabilities, was proclaimed king alongside Alexander's unborn son by his wife Roxana. Neither would live long. Over the next 40 years, in a series of brutal wars, Alexander's commanders carved his empire into fragments. Cassandros had Olympias executed and eventually murdered both Philippos III and the young Alexander IV. Ptolemaeus seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would end with Cleopatra 3 centuries later. Seleucus claimed Persia in the east. Antigonos and his son Demetrios fought for Makedonia and Greece. Hundreds of thousands died in these wars of the Diadochitha, successors, more than had died in all of Alexander's conquests. Alexander had built nothing that could survive his own heartbeat. We have told this story from the conqueror's perspective because history is written by victors. But what of those who stood in Alexander's path? The Thebans, who were massacred or enslaved, their crime was merely demanding freedom from a foreign overlord. The Tyrians crucified along the beach, they had defended their city as any people might. The Persian families who watched their empire dissolve, they had built a civilization that brought law and roads and relative peace to lands from India to Egypt. The inhabitants of cities in Bactria and Sogdiana, who faced campaigns of terror and mass crucifixions when they resisted. The Indian soldiers trampled by Macedonian cavalry. The uncounted thousands who died on the Jedrosian march. The women taken as concubines. The children orphaned. The civilizations disrupted or destroyed. Alexander's body count defies precise calculation. But modern estimates suggest his campaigns killed between 100,000 and 250,000 soldiers and possibly equal numbers of civilians. He depopulated entire regions of Central Asia. He left trauma that echoed for generations. Was Alexander history's greatest military commander? By purely tactical metrics, perhaps? He never lost a battle. He conquered more territory in less time than any figure before or since. He demonstrated strategic genius, tactical flexibility, and personal courage that remain studied in military academies today. But what did he build? The cities he founded survived. The Greek language and culture spread across Asia, blending with local traditions in ways that shaped the Hellenistic world. Trade routes opened, ideas flowed. Yet he also demonstrated that one man's genius and ambition could drown the world in blood for nothing more than personal glory. He showed that the brightest flame can also be the most destructive. He proved that conquest without purpose leaves only ashes. Alexander died in Babylon, far from home, surrounded by men already plotting to tear apart everything he had built. His empire outlived him by approximately 2 decades before fragmenting entirely. His legacy is blood and legend in equal measure. Perhaps the truest assessment comes from Alexander himself. Asked on his deathbed what he had achieved, he reportedly replied, "An endless series of miseries." Whether he meant his own life or the miseries he had inflicted, we cannot know. The answer may be both. History's most brilliant commander was also one of its most destructive forces, a man who could have been anything and chose to be a conqueror, who could have built lasting peace and chose instead eternal war. The thunder that rolled at Gordian was not applause from the gods, it was a warning none would heed.